And with that, I will hand things over to Rama. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Dan said, I'm going to get us started with our land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous peoples of this land. Despite tremendous hardship and being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. And I'm really excited to introduce Chris Harvey today. Chris Harvey is the tribal linguist for the Mohican language at the Stockbridge-Munsee community. Together, he and the community are reviving the Mohican language. For decades, Chris has worked with Indigenous languages throughout North America in the fields of both formal linguistics and technology, as languagegeek.com. He is a proud learner and speaker of Welsh and unabashedly speaks it whenever possible. And so, as Dan said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, in the text chat, and then at the end, we'll read through them and give Chris a chance to answer them. So without further ado, Chris.
Onit, wawinit go naman thick mo mawe. Danamena ane pon yak. Chris Harvey dene wethe. Dan kache ninta pain Hamiltonic, Ontario, Canada. Ninakatok. All right, let's do it. I'm Chris Harvey. I'm the linguist for the Mohican language at the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin, but I'm from Canada, and that is where I'm joining you today. I have this presentation that's going to look at some of the broader aspects of what the Mohican language is, and then we'll zoom into a couple interesting aspects of what I do and what we've been doing. And throughout this talk, let me get that out of the way. I'm going to ask you to practice along with me, even though you're muted, but I can see your mouths move, and we'll learn some phrases. Sans pewe, quampanachin hima, mawe, quampanachin hima, quampanachin hima. Onit. This is a way to greet somebody in the morning, or a group of people. Or, all right, Mona, if you could mute your microphone, thank you. So this is made up of a lot of different little parts. The K at the beginning implies I'm speaking to you. The wampan is the word for dawn, but it's made up of two smaller parts that have to do with, the white light. So wamp means white and un is a verb ending. Following that is achen, which means something along the lines of survive or made it through. And hima is all you guys. So kwampan achen hima. I'm glad to see that you all survived through the night and made it till morning. But we can also just say go namanthe. Or if I'm speaking to a group of people, go namanthe ma. Mawe, go namanthe. I want to see your lips move, everybody. Go namanthe. Onit. And that's just the basic greeting. Are you feeling good? You feeling well? Ko namanthe. If you're speaking to one person, ko namanthe ma. If you're speaking to a group. One of the things about the Mohican language is you always have to be aware of everybody involved in the question, because there'll be bits that you tack onto the verb. And the response is no namanthe. No namanthe. I'm doing fine. So you got the K at the beginning of ko namanthe refers to you. The N at the beginning, no namanthe, refers to me. So that's how we greet each other all the time as we're learning the language. Let's start from a big view. the Algonquian language family, of which Mohican is a member. So this is a nice old linguistics map of North America, listing all the different language families. And by language, all these different language families are as different from each other as English is from Chinese. So each color that you see on this map are completely unrelated to each other. And the Algonquian family is one of the largest in both number of speakers and breadth across the continent. And you can see it goes all the way out to the edge of the Rocky Mountains, across through the Great Lakes, down into the southern Appalachia, and then off to the Atlantic coast. These are all Algonquian languages, meaning that Mohican is related to all of these. Now, the Algonquian languages can be divided into different kind of groupings. So if you can imagine, at one point there was a single language, and that spread across that whole range that you saw in the previous map, and it spread in groups. So one of the groups made it to the East Coast, the Atlantic shore, and then spread north and south along the shore. So the languages on the east are all more closely related to each other, it seems, than they are to all the other Algonquian languages. So, for example, for me, if I listen to somebody speaking Abenaki or Munsee, it's a lot closer than if I listen to somebody speaking Menominee or Ojibwe. And the Eastern Algonquian languages are over here, and Mohican or Mahican is was traditionally spoken in this approximate area. Now, why is it sometimes Mohican and sometimes is it Mahican? Well, in the language, Ma'iginiak, the first vowel, ma, is that an O or an A? So English or Dutch or French people who heard that sound were, oh, what should I write it with? But it's actually on. It's a nasal vowel. On. Ma'iginiak. And literally, Mohican is a river that the tide flows into and out of. So that's what you've probably heard. Maybe it means the waters that are never still, or the waters that ebb and flow. Mohican is a kind of river, a tidal river, where the tide goes up the river and down. So the people are named after that aspect of the river. There are people who live very nearby who have names that sound similar to Mohican, like Mohawk or Mohegan. The Mohawk people are Haudenosaunee neighbors to the northwest of the Mohican people, and that language is totally separate, in no way related. And the Mohegan people, who are today in Connecticut and that neck of the woods, that's named after Mohiksuck, which is the word for wolf in their language. So even though Mohegan and Mohican sound almost the same in English and are often confused in historical documentation, the origins of the two names are very different. So the final kind of geographical zoom in I'd like to do is just pointing out some of the places in the traditional territory and the names that exist in Mohican for them. So Ma'akin Ituk is a suffix meaning river. So the Hudson River is the Ma'akin Ituk, the river that flows in and out with the tide. Another river, Wathatinik for Housatonic River, means like over the hills, beyond the hills. And then the Holthik River. Holth is a kettle. So Holthik means at the kettle or near the kettle or a pot or something like that. Holthik. The Stockbridge community itself, Wanachquitukwuk, which means sort of at the end of the river. There's Albany Kastenik, which is a borrowing from Dutch, Kasten for castle, so at the fort. And there's Chegameuk or Chikamako, which was the site of the Moravian mission. All right. So between the kind of turn of the 17 to 1800s, in a variety of stages and different paths, the Mohican people were removed from the Mohican area and sent west. Where the people ended up depended a lot on which mission they were living nearby. So the Stockbridge mission people ended up in Wisconsin. The Moravian people ended up in eastern Ohio, in a place called Gannatahutten, where they were massacred by a local militia. And the few survivors, like of this entire community, the few survivors that escaped, moved up into Ontario. So that's sort of an extremely short version of the story of how people ended up in Wisconsin. All right, language break. Keithwogan, counting. So we've got the numbers up to 5. Gutta, Nesa, Nacha, Nawa, Nonen. We'll just practice one. Gutta, Gutta, or Gutta. These numbers were remembered by an elder who we worked with early on in the revitalization process. So we've got unbroken memory of the numbers here. Now, unlike the decimal number systems that you may be used to, like English goes up to 10 and then 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, Algonquian languages are base 5. So you count up to 5, Gutta, Nesa, Nacha, Nawa, Nonen, and then Guitance is 6. So that ons at the end is like teen, like 15, 16, but it means plus 5. So Gutta plus 5, Guitance is 6. Nechanso is Necha for 3, plus 5 is 8. Chanso. And then it goes up to 10, and then it becomes base 10 over top of a base 5. So it's a really interesting number system that spread throughout the whole language family. All right. So I'd like to look at the documentation that exists in the Mohican language, spreading from 1700s up until the 1900s, early 1900s. And this is everything that exists in the Mohican language that we know of, is in this range. So we've got word lists in both Moravian and Stockbridge dialects. The word lists can range from 70, 80 pages of vocabulary down to maybe 1 or 2 pages with just a couple words on them. But every single source is extremely valuable because it helps with pronunciation. It might have a word that we weren't sure about, and it gives confirmation. So we've got these word lists. In addition, there are missionary written records that are more extended text. So a couple of these include personal letters that were written by Moravians who traveled out and then sent back a letter to home saying, you know, this is all the stuff that I'm visiting. They're not as interesting as you'd hope. A lot of it is, my heart is open to you and it's so good. I hope you're all having a good time. Wish you were here. See you later. But it's cool because it's a personal letter. It's a different style of writing. There's also translations of the Passion, the Westminster Catechism, and a couple chapter biblical verses, like a few Psalms and such. And these were all translated. So as primary documents, they're great because they're long. But because they're translations from English or German or what have you, the word order tends to just follow. Here's an English word, here's a Mohican word, here's an English word, here's a Mohican word. So it's unclear how good, how stilted or how unnatural it may have sounded to the speakers. And then in the early 1900s, linguists came by Wisconsin and made field notes, including traditional stories of people who could still remember how to speak. So here's an example of a word list from 1802. It was sent to Thomas Jefferson. And we've got the word, in English, it says a polecat. And then in the Mohican on the side, it's got skonksis, which in the modern language we'd pronounce skonktith, which is a skunk. So you can hear the word for skunk in there, skonk, skonksis. Got lots of animal names in this one. It's nice. Here is the 1795 translation of the Westminster Catechism. And this first translation was by a missionary called John Sargent. The later retranslation was done by a Mohican person, but it's largely the same. The cool thing, though, that we get in these missionary documents are complex words had to be created that match the concepts of the English. So you'll notice that a lot of the words in here are really long because they're building new vocabulary to represent foreign concepts. So the word for commandment, I gotta move this. Katgetwogen, literally means something like a teaching, something that is taught. So we got lots of great vocabulary in these missionary documents. And then here's an example of a story by William Dick, who we will meet in a second. And this is a traditional story about how a young man is trying to become a great hunter. And here he is speaking to Papako, which is a partridge. So the partridge plays the role of the teacher in this story, showing the young man interesting and often humorous ways to hunt. It's a good story. So here's William Dick, the gentleman that gave that story to the linguist Truman Michelson. And so Makwa Wampe is his native name. And he had sort of the notoriety or the fame as the last speaker of Mohican. So when he died, in his obituary in the newspapers, it talked about him being the last speaker of Mohican. Well, we'll see about that. We'll see about last speakers. The fascination that people have with the last of or the last of. No, he's a speaker and a really good speaker and a hugely important person in our revitalization of the language because he helped by giving a number of really important stories. So maybe she's the last speaker, Noche Onsqua, or Bernice Huntington. Maybe she's the last speaker. She was in her 30s when William Dick was giving the stories to the linguists, and so she outlived them by decades and decades. And when another linguist came called Harrington in the 40s, he talked to her and got a whole bunch of more vocabulary. She's like a walking dictionary. She knew words for all kinds of things, but perhaps was unable to say sentences of connected speech. So she knew lots of words, but I don't have any examples of her in like long sentences and such. But maybe she was the last speaker. Nah, she ain't the last speaker. But she's a very important person in the revitalization of the language. Funny story, actually. Her name, Noche Onsqua. At some point, Harrington, this linguist, he was interviewing her and taking notes. So, how do you say this? How do you say that? How do you say that? What's the word for this? And she would respond either with the word, and if she didn't know it, she would give a Menominee word because she also spoke Menominee. And if she didn't know the Menominee word, she would just, I don't know. So Harrington asked her, "What's the name for queen? What's the name for queen?" And so she responds, "The word for queen is Noche Onsqua," which is her name. She gave her own name as the translation for queen. And of course, Harrington writes it dutifully down. Oh, now we know the word for queen and all that. So, decades and decades, a century later, I'm looking at this document and I had a good laugh because she was kind of pulling his leg a bit. And the more time you spend with these rememberers of the language, the more you start to learn their sense of humor and what kind of people they were. Now then, so maybe she was the last speaker. Well, elders today still remember vocabulary. And I've got their recordings right here. So this is Sheila Miller.
Spuckeye, meat rind.
Did that come through? On it. All right. Spuckeye literally means pork skin or pork rind. So she remembered that one. Nori Malone.
You see, they say Damicas. They say that's coming when they say that. But that's all I ever known.
Jamaica. Come on in.
Picha Tapiwan. So whatever those may mean, perhaps we can find out how the correct sound of them.
Pechik. I think he's saying Peche Katape, which would be come and sit down. Peche, come over here. All of these words, almost everything that the elders remembered had to do with visiting people. So you can imagine they were little kids running around the kitchen and people would come over and visit and there'd be a knock on the door. Jamaica, come on in. Peche Katape. Have us, why don't you sit over here? Fantastic, great. We and the more that the elders would kind of sit down and talk to each other, the more words they would remember. Now today, we also have a family of speakers.
No. No, wow, nits. Kawai na kao na pe na pa. Wow, nito. Na pok to te kekan. No. Oh, look at Pokto! Gone, stop. Gone. Tono, come on for Unka. Oh, yeah. Kau na pisquafo. Oh, swing. Kawai na kau, Bryn. Nia, oh, stop. Got no. No, me swap the cake na. Mbokte.
All right, so that was Brock Schreiber, one of the learners of the language, who just a couple of hundred words in decided that he was going to speak it with his kids, the youngest one from birth. And so now we've got a family of speakers where, previously we had last speakers in the 1920s and 30s. So some of the questions that came up when we were first starting off with the revitalization program was, so which dialect do we want to use? There's a Moravian dialect. There's a Stockbridge dialect. We've got people from sources from very early in the 1700s to sources later in the 1900s. And the consensus of the people, you know, as we were talking about this was, well, everything is valuable. Absolutely every shred and scrap of the language is immensely valuable. Now, the pronunciation we use is from the Stockbridge dialect, because that's where the people that live in the community originated from. But we've got that excellent lexicons in the Moravian dialect, so we use all those. We just pronounce them as if they were Stockbridge. As we saw from like that word for commandment, the 1700s materials have lots of interesting things to teach us about how words are put together. And the 1900s has the most accurate pronunciation for Stockbridge because the linguists who showed up knew phonetic alphabets, which I can then read. So we're pretty confident on the pronunciation because of the high quality of the records that were left behind. And in the end, there's a very minimal difference between the dialects, and it's not at all hard to switch between them or kind of mention, oh, well, this is how the Moravians would have said it. This is how it would have been said in the 1700s. So, for example, in the 1700s for the Stockbridge dialect, we've got the word on the left, just spelled out with English letters. The one on the right is from a 1900s document, and here we have some phonetic symbols and stress notification and all that kind of stuff. So we can put those together and we get namenon, which is to the man or for the man, or a man in the as object of a verb. Namenon. Yeah, we're not going to do that one either. So we've got all this documentation, all of these scans, microfilms, old books, stuff that's sitting in the basement of the American Philosophical Association or in the Smithsonian. And so my job from the very beginning was to figure out vocabulary, figure out the grammar, figure out the pronunciation, and pull a language out of this document, this pile of documents. And so I'm going to go through a really kind of quick example of what I do on an hourly basis to get all this language from the written form into the family, into the kitchen where people can learn it. So I need to know a couple things. So I've got 4 steps here. The first thing I need to know is, where does the source come from? Then I have to look at other examples in that same source. Then when I have a good idea of what the word might be, I try and break it down into individual units. Remember, we saw at the very beginning with Kwampanachénhima, how you can build one word out of lots of little bits. And then I look at cognate languages, so other Eastern Algonquian languages, to try and see if there's hints in there of similar sounding words for similar meanings. So here's an example. I see this in a source. All right, so what am I going to do with this? It kind of looks like Michitquinoti. I wonder what it is. So it shows up in a sentence, in one of the Moravian word lists. And I put the sentence there below, Awano Mechtquenoti. And then beside it is a translation. Whose basket is this? All right. So I got a sentence, and I'm going to start trying to figure out what it means and how to pronounce it. So I know this is a German, that the person writing it down knew German because it's from a Moravian document. And I know they were educated in like ancient Greek as well. All right. So, because they're German, I know that the CH isn't a ch, it's a ha or a cha, something along those lines. And the EI at the end, well, in German, that might be I or A or I. Okay. So now I look at the first two words, a wa no. I already know those words. It means who in this thing. So I'm left with this mecht quenote, meaning basket. So I look in other sources for anything that might have to do with basket. And I see in a 1900s linguistic source, there's a verb, mutaquenotayak, meaning he or she is making baskets. And I can see the first half of this word, mutaquenotai, is the part meaning baskets, because I know the suffix aa means to make something or gather it up. And it gives me a good guide to pronunciation because I recognize the phonetic symbols. So we get mutaquenotai. And there it is, mutaquenotai. Matuk, now I'm going to break it down into words. Matuk means tree or wood. A note is a container, and I is a noun ending that just shows up for a lot of things. Matuquenotai. And now if I look at other languages, in Muncie, michtquenotai is a basket. Sounds familiar. In Maliseet, michuwagonitut, inut, sorry, at the end, inut means basket. In Penobscot, there's namesinuti. Names is a fish, so a fish basket. And tankagan for a basket in Unami, well, it doesn't look helpful. But the other three have bits in there that I can use. For matuquenotai, specifically a wooden basket. All right. No pe om. Kanao nitmo. Well, I hope to see you all again. But often when we're saying goodbye to each other, we just say macheme om. Macheme means soon, and om is a nice little ending that means if all goes according to plan, this will probably happen. So macheme om, I'll see you soon unless something happens and gets in the way, but otherwise we'll make sure it happens. Macheme om. All right, now before I finish off, there's one more thing I wanted to show you. All right. So, what I didn't talk a lot about in this presentation is how we teach it and that sort of thing. If you're interested in that, put your questions in the answers, and I'd be happy to talk more about how the language is taught. One of the great resources you can have as a teacher is 12 and 15-year-old children who you can get to do stuff in Minecraft for you. So I tasked my two boys, my two sons, I said, we want to make a Minecraft world in the Mohican language. What could you do? And they made this massive world where you can do all kinds of games and quests and competitions in Minecraft. And they made this little video to show you guys. So I'll play it now.
Mohican.
Na'amaw. Kwechemo. Goskos. Goskos.
Kwechemo.
Na'amaw. Kwechemo.
All right. So what you saw there, the first at the very beginning was a sort of a hover over a village they created. And in each of the wigwampen, each of the houses, is a transporter that takes you to another part of the world where you can play a game. And then there's also storytellers that they placed under trees and beside fires, and you can go talk to them and they'll read or they'll say one of the stories. The part with the Mesoamerican temples was my 12-year-old's game, and it's like a scavenger hunt. And so you can go inside the temples and you can find like shirts and shoes and all that kind of stuff. And every time you throw a shirt, it'll say Hamit, Hamit. And so you can practice the words as you throw articles of clothing at each other. The next one, which was more kind of tutor, I think, was my 15-year-old's scavenger hunt, and it had food hiding. So you saw at one point they found an apple, and so you throw the apple, it says Apenis. The bit with the animals, that was a hunting game they made. So you have to paddle in a boat off to an island, and the island is filled with animals that are constantly spawning and always say their own name. And the job in that game is you get these little cords, leashes, and you can leash the animals, put them in your boat, and drag them off to the village. And the kids who can get the most animals back to the village, and then they have to name them all and all that kind of stuff. We also have competition games where the Mohican kids are going to challenge the Menominee kids, who are going to challenge the Ojibwe kids. The idea is everyone wears headphones and is on a common like chat. So you got to say your strategy in the language so that the other team doesn't understand. So we're hoping to get esports built inside Minecraft happening soon. So thank you very much. Onewen Jothak, Onewen Jothak. Kuchemoneku. Ask me some questions. Rama, if you want to fire some questions my way, I'll be happy to answer.
Sure, we've got a couple questions here in the chat. So the first one is, do you refer to any modern Algonquin languages like Maliseet where there are still native speakers?
Constantly. Yeah, is that every time we come across a piece of vocabulary, I compare it with every other Algonquian language I can get information on. And so if it's in Maliseet and it's the same kind of word, I treat that as confirmation, like, okay. And so I've kind of had to learn how all the other Eastern Algonquian and Central Algonquian languages work as well. I mean, fortunately, I already knew Korean Ojibwe fairly well. But yeah, by all means, definitely do that.
Okay, so our next question, is the Stockbridge dialect what would have been spoken in the Mahakanituk Valley before having to leave the valley for Stockbridge?
So there are two main dialects that I was calling Moravian and Stockbridge, or you could call them Eastern and Western, Stockbridge being East, Chicomico being West, the Moravian mission. It looks to me that the dialects were probably divided by river valley, right? So the Hudson River Valley would have had the Western variants of the language, and the Housatonic River Valley would have had the Eastern. That said, people traveled. And so you do come across Eastern dialect speakers in Chicomico documents. So it's really hard to say without... it's really hard to say because when the documentation started coming out, you had a lot of movement. But I would say largely the Hudson Valley is Western dialect, the Housatonic Valley is Eastern dialect.
Are there online classes where people can learn this language?
Yes. Yes, there are. There are currently, what we're trying to do is come up with a teach yourself Mohican in your own time, because scheduling is difficult to get people together and what have you. So Brock, the gentleman who you saw in the video, he's putting together a huge stack of movies and other learning materials that I've made, and we're putting them all together so that you can do some learning, like just the beginner stuff on your own. And then we will have maybe one night a week where you can come and talk things over and practice and that sort of thing. So we ran that for a while. It's currently on hiatus until we can sort out who's going to be teaching what. Probably in the new year, we'll see. But I can happily maybe give Dan or Rama the links to these things once we have them up, and then they can make them available to all of you.
That sounds great. So the Minecraft world is such a clever way to teach kids. Is this the first time it's been used in Mohican language instruction?
Yes. The only Mohican language instruction is us. And so we try everything. What seems to be really popular with kids and adults alike is play. So we've got card games that we play. We've got Minecraft that we play. Myself and some of the more advanced learners get together and play Settlers of Catan or Risk or Ticket to Ride. We'll play it online in the afternoons. And it's not so much about learning the language associated with the game as it is about trash talking each other. You know what I mean? All the language that goes on around the games is really the key. Because, to play the game, you might only need to know, a couple things. You need to know the numbers on the dice. You need to know whether you're getting sheep or stones or wheat if you're playing Catan. But a lot of the fun stuff is when somebody rolls something really good and we'll say, we'll swear at them or something like that and have fun with it. So yeah, games are central to what we do because people like to play them.
When was the Mohican language first written down?
So the first writings in Mohican were early 1700s. At least writings that are in the context of the language. I'll explain what I mean. There would have been, like, the Dutch sail up a river and say, "What's that called?" And they hear it and they write it down. Place names, or what's your name, and somebody gives their personal name. So I guess the first time a boat went into the Mohican River and said, "What's your name?" That would have been the first time it was written down in like the Latin alphabet. But as far as like in a linguistics context or a language context for speakers, it would have been early 1700s.
What is your own background as a linguist and as an investigator of Algonquin languages?
So I have been weird for a long time. And when I was 12 years old, 11 years old or something, I was in the Oakville Public Library in Ontario, Canada. And I was going through the language section because, that's what you do when you go to the library. And I found a book called Learn to Speak Cree, which is a language in Northern Canada. And so I grabbed it. And I read it. Oh, I'm going to take this home. This is going to be fantastic. And I saw it said for library use only on the spine. So I put it back. And, Mama, can we go to the library tomorrow? All right. go to the library, reading the Cree book. I couldn't believe it because I didn't know that these languages existed. You know, late 70s, early 80s, these things weren't talked about. At least for a kid in the city wouldn't have known anything about this. And I just couldn't believe it that my neighbors to the north spoke such a cool language. And so eventually I convinced the librarian to let me take it home. And I essentially had that book at home forever. I would just renew it constantly. And so I was always going to be a linguist. And I was always going to be doing native languages of North America because that was just, it only made sense to me that why am I learning a language from far away when I can be learning the language from right here? So I ended up studying linguistics in university, and with always focusing on either Haudenosaunee languages or Algonquian languages, especially in historical context. So a lot of looking at early documentation and seeing how the sounds, specifically the sounds of that language, are different from how it's spoken today. And then while all that was going on, I've also learned Celtic languages, Welsh primarily. I used to know Irish, but the Welsh interferes with it to some degree. But if I'm in Ireland for a few hours, the Irish starts coming out again. And then there's the technology side, which is a whole other story for a whole other day. But languagegeek.com is my online presence from, geez, the late 90s, early 2000s, somewhere around there. And that's all the tech stuff that I do is under Language Geek.
So switching gears a little bit, but how large is the community today and how many are actively working to learn the language? And by the way, love what your boys did. I was thinking the only way to get kids interested is to build an app or a game right before you showed this.
Though the great thing about Minecraft is we didn't have to build an app because it's already made. We're just co-opting what's already available, which is really different from how things were like 15 years ago, where you would have to get like $100,000 to pay programmers to make a video game for a native language that hardly anybody would ever play. Now you can just, chain your kids to their iPad and which is really easy because that's where they are anyway, and just say, yeah, make me a Minecraft world and I'll pay you for it. Woo! So it was great. The community itself, I think, like in and around the reservation is about 1,500 to 2,000. And learners, we've got a set of maybe 10 people who have been learning. I mean, I started working there in 2018, who have been learning since then. And then we've had like dozens and dozens of people go through the beginners courses and intermediate courses. And now we have the little boy you saw, Lucan, who is playing the card game. He's our first native speaker born since the 1800s. So he grew up knowing Mohican from day one. And so we're all curious to see where he goes with it. Other cousins and friends he has want to sing the same songs, the same Mohican songs, and watch the same videos. So it's spreading.
How large is the glossary of modern Mohican?
Well, if I look at my vocabulary here, okay, hold on. You know what I'll do? I'll do a screen share. Screen share. Okay. I'll just load up our vocabulary here. It's big. All right. So I'll just scroll through it. We're at the ends. And now we're in this verb suffixes. That's how big it is. So we got lots. We got lots. And the nice thing too is that we have we know how words are built. So if we need a new word for something, like we're trying to think of what we want to call email, we can build it up with parts of words we already know.
So it seems like Mohican in use by native speakers was entirely spoken and not written. Any writings appear to be by others who were in contact with native speakers. Is there a tonal aspect to spoken Mohican?
Well, yes and no. The first things in Mohican were written by non-speakers, but very soon after, speakers themselves started writing their own materials. So, like the second version of the Westminster Catechism was translated by a speaker. We've got a collection of Moravian hymns that were sung by speakers, and Moravian hymns are sort of improvised lyrically. So we've got a fair amount of stuff that speakers themselves did. So I would say that any writings appear to be by others. So there were writings by speakers as well. Is there a tonal aspect? Is that like grammatical tone? Kind of like, I can assume, kind of like what Chinese or Vietnamese or Zulu does? No. I mean, there's phrasal tone, right? Like if you're going to ask a question, your voice goes up at the end. But words aren't distinguished by tone. They can be distinguished by stress, what syllable the stress falls on, and that can be very complex. It's very so like if I say mawe, well, just mawe means he or she is going to go do something. Mawe, but if I say mawe, that means I'm going to go do something. So mawe versus mawe changes whether I'm doing it or he or she is doing it. So the stress plays an important role, but not tone.
So the question I think maybe everybody in the group had, so I'm happy that someone asked it, but if you feel comfortable saying them, what are some Mohican swears?
Muthkete. Muthkete. That's the stuff that comes out your rear end is muthkete. Or kathatya. Kathatya means shut the hell up, but you can replace hell with something else. Yeah, there's lots of them. And the cool thing is that they're made, they're constructed. So you got the swear words don't come at the beginning or the end. They sort of get inserted halfway through the verb, and you can put them in any verb. So there's this whole art that we're learning to swearing. It's great fun.
Are you able to understand anything about the Mohican worldview from the language? Is there something to understand beyond the names for things? Any surprises?
I'm just going to check if any of my colleagues are on today. Doesn't look like anybody did. I would say is there anything that I can understand about the worldview? We get insights daily. Every word is a story. Absolutely, every word is a story. And the way that the words are built up of other concepts tells you a lot about how speakers perceived, philosophy, thought, reality, the world around them. So, I think one interesting thing might be dîner ta'an. Dîner ta'an. I'm thinking the eight dîner ta'an. That eta shows up in a bunch of words having to do with thinking. So dineta means I'm thinking along those lines. I'm thinking in that kind of way. Dineta. That eta is also the word for heart. Nda. So there's a relationship between feeling and thinking being the same thing. You know what I mean? We talk about mind, body, soul, you know, that English divides up into different concepts. Mohican doesn't do that. It's the same word. So there's stuff like that are fun. And certainly like the learners, you know, will often just show up in the morning and say, oh, I totally get that sentence now that we were doing the other day. I totally figured it out, man, and it changed the way I think about things. So, yeah, I mean, if you ever have us back, I can bring some of the guys and they can talk about their experiences. But for sure, it's a life changer. It's an absolute life changer learning this language. And that's for me, someone who doesn't come from there. Like imagine the people who were born and raised there and discovering new things. It's fantastic.
So I think we've got 2 more questions left. We
Okay.
won't, because we're about there. We'll only take these 2. But how is your work funded?
The council funds me. So we're not trying for grants or anything like that because grants end or we don't get them. And you don't want to spend years building up a program only to have the grant run out. So it's been on the advice of people who've done revitalization work before us. The funding comes from within, and we can keep it consistent.
All right. And our final question, how do you see this project in terms of the greater work of reconciliation?
From my own perspective, I can't think of any better way I could do it. You know, I'm a language guy, and I can give back to the people whose land I have born and raised and live on by helping in what I'm good at. So personally, I this is the best I can do. So I hope it's all right. I think that the broader community being interested in native languages as living, breathing entities that deserve the same stage as English and all the other world languages is a huge act of reconciliation. That these aren't museum pieces, that they aren't, you know, ways to know what a place name is, but that these are ways that people express their identity and their understanding of how the world works. And I think as non-Indigenous people, it's our job to make sure that their voice is just the same as anyone else's. It's on equal footing.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Chris, for your presentation and for teaching us all about Mohican. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a great night.
Chemiam Jothuk.